Hello and welcome to the second podcast episode of Clean Energy Dialogues. My name is Thiago Barral and I'm the Executive President of EPE, the Brazilian agency responsible for energy statistics and planning studies to support the Ministry of Mines and Energy. We're co-hosting these podcasts with the 21st Century Power Partnership, an initiative of CEM, the Clean Energy Ministerial, that has been around since 2012. EPE and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, are strong partners in helping to run the Power Partnership initiative. We are excited to kick off this second episode as a contribution to the upcoming 12th Clean Energy Ministerial meeting being hosted by the government of Chile. And our topic today is electric vehicles and their integration to the grid. And for this, we have three superb guests to help us understand the subject from different perspectives. Our first guest is Ilan Kupperstein. Ilan serves as a C40 Deputy Regional Director for Latin America, responsible for managing over 18 programs in the 12 C40 cities in the region. Previously, he worked at the China-Brazil Center for Climate Change, where he worked in bilateral projects related to biofuels, clean energy innovation policies, electric vehicles, and carbon capture and storage. Our second guest is Martina Wikström. Martina is a research and innovation program manager at the Swedish Energy Agency and has been working in the field of e-mobility for over 10 years. Today she works foremost with the development of public policy for deployment of charging infrastructure. And our third guest is Matteo Muratori, who leads a team of engineers and analysts at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, to explore system-level sustainable solutions for the transformation of the transportation sector, including alternative fuel vehicles and related infrastructure, and the synergies between transportation and the power grid. Ilan, Martina, and Matteo, welcome to this podcast, and thank you so much for being available for this conversation. Martina, I have a first question for you. Well, the highest penetration rates for EVs today are in Europe. In countries such as Norway, plug-in hybrids and light-duty battery electric vehicles have reached 50% of total annual car sales. In Sweden, you've reached 30%, and other countries on the continent also have relatively high shares of EVs compared to other continents. So my question is, how are European countries promoting the adoption of EVs? How much of this growth is based on subsidies or price signals, investment in charging infrastructure, environmental regulation, and of course long-term business strategies in the car industry?
What happened in Europe last year? As you mentioned, Sweden surpassing 30% of EVs in the new car sales. And we saw that the EU in general went from a level of 3% of new car sales in 2019 to 11% in 2020. That was really the result of new EU regulation put into force, which implies a stricter CO2 emission target for the OEMs operating in the EU market. This target is fleet-based and stipulates a target for new cars that is 95 grams of CO2 per kilometer. This means that OEMs that don't reach this target has to pay substantial penalties. And we see that this EU regulation creates a strong push for the EV introduction rate in the EU. However, these EVs are not evenly diffused over the European countries, but we see them concentrate in different markets, as you mentioned, Sweden as well as Netherlands. And these markets have favorable conditions. And these conditions are no longer really based on national incentives and purchase incentives. But more importantly, these markets have been working continuously with EV promotion for a long time. And perhaps in the beginning, it was a lot of purchase incentives, but it's also been working with public investments in charging infrastructure and also capacity building in different levels of the public system, both local, regional, and national level. And this has altogether sort of prepared the society for this. And this is the EU, but this has always also been the case of Norway. There they worked also with generous incentives, but they have done this continuously for a long time. If you look in the case of Sweden, it's just not promotion, but also a lot of R&D investments to really understand the impact of more electric mobility. And we have also been focusing quite a lot on removing unintended barriers, such as legal barriers.
Thank you. Now, Ilan, I'd like to hear from you now, because we heard from Martina about EV experience so far in Europe. So my question is, how can you relate the conditions in Europe with those in Latin American countries? And I mean socioeconomic conditions, income, urban infrastructure and services, and mobility patterns. And if I also may ask, would you have any good examples in terms of public policies that focused on the adoption of EVs in the region in Latin America? And how do you measure their success and cost effectiveness?
Hi, Thiago. Thank you for your question and for the invitation. This is actually a good question, which I believe we can separate, because electric vehicles have different markets, for instance, for private vehicles or for trucks and buses. Regarding electric vehicles in general, in Latin America, we see several policies being already implemented. The most common EV practice in the region is the exemption or reduction of vehicle import taxes. We see this in Panama, in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Uruguay, that have already mandated brakes on EVs. Another policy that we can also see in the region is tax breaks on purchases. This is something that we see in Costa Rica, in Ecuador, in Mexico, while some other cities have partly implemented this, like Peru and Uruguay. However, among the incentives lacking to a greater extent in the region are those related to the use and circulation of vehicles. This is something we see in Europe. For instance, in Norway, there are municipal regulations that incentivize the use of EVs in certain areas of the city where only EVs can park, for example. So these are multi-scale incentives that we are still developing in the region. Having said that, Latin America is a leader in the deployment of electric bus fleets, led by Chile and Colombia. So these two countries now, focusing especially on the fleets in Santiago and Bogota, have the largest electric bus fleets outside of China, as we know, still concentrates most of the electric vehicle market. And this is due to several reasons. The first one is, in Latin America, over 70% of all trips are taken on public transport. So it seems right to start the transition from a public transit perspective, because this brings additional benefits and value to the transition rather than focusing on private EVs, which, although they are important, it is still crucial for climate, environmental, economic, social reasons, given the inequalities in the region, to prioritize the quality of public transit. The second issue is most countries in the region can benefit from a relatively clean grid. That is the case with countries like Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, which rely on clean sources. So electrifying the fleets, and here not only buses, but any kind of vehicles, is also an opportunity to meet the climate goals of the country's NDCs and other environmental issues. And finally, we should highlight that in Latin America, we saw an innovative business model where the energy utilities entered into contracts with operators and sometimes the bus providers in a leasing contract. That was the big innovation in the contracts in both Chile and Colombia, with differences. But this is really an innovation that could be taken elsewhere and could be spread to other parts of the world. So in a sense, we're lagging behind for private electric vehicles, but Latin America is really leading when it comes to electric buses for many different reasons. But we hope and we estimate that this will only grow in the next coming years.
Just a quick follow-up question about this topic, because I know, Ilan, you are somehow familiar with the Chinese EV market as well. How would you say the Chinese market stands when compared to Latin America or Europe, as you made this comparison between private EVs and electric buses?
Well, China has taken a decision almost 10 years ago to lead the transition to electric vehicles. So that means that different government agencies, ministries started working on this, and mainly with incentives. So Shenzhen, a city in southern China, was perhaps the center of this policy and is the first city to have electrified its entire fleet. So the city has over 16,000 buses. For us to have an idea, the whole world together doesn't reach the number of electric buses in the city of Shenzhen. Having said that, China follows an innovation pattern where they invest in certain technologies in a learning curve experience. So we see, for instance, the experience in Shenzhen was there was such a strong incentive in various ways that if a battery stopped working, there would be spare batteries for the buses to keep running. This is not the reality in other parts of the world. We know that in cash-strapped regions, like especially now with the COVID crisis, which is the case of Latin America, we have to be very careful with the business model so that we don't increase the costs of the operation, especially for the passengers. So what we can learn from China mainly is the technical issues. So as one of the key topics here in this conversation, the integration with the grid, what kind of adaptations were needed in the parking garages for the buses, how did the batteries perform under different situations? And all of this has been very helpful. But regarding business models, China had such a strong incentive package that we don't have the luxury to follow that. So we have to use that technical knowledge to really build careful, innovative business models, which is what we've been doing.
Well, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing these comparisons between different countries, regions, and their experiences. Now, Matteo, we've just heard from Martina and Ilan about trends of scaling up the adoption of EVs. But let's now take a look at the integration of this growing number of EVs, their charging stations, and the grid, or power systems, more broadly speaking. How do you see we can prepare for this integration to happen efficiently? I would say, in other words, splitting this into two questions: how to plan for the proper upgrades to the distribution systems, and what other tools can enable EV grid integration besides physical upgrades to the distribution systems?
Hi, Thiago. It's great to be here with you today and nice to virtually see everyone. It's a pleasure to join this great group. The transportation is the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emission globally. Given that the system is highly dependent on petroleum today, even though, as we have heard earlier, the Scandinavian countries are really leading the transition to electric vehicles. But EVs are really a revolution. They finally offer a pathways for us to decarbonize the sector. And what we are seeing is that many studies are projecting that EV would be highly successful, both for personal as well as for commercial vehicles. So talking about light duty, 2-3-wheelers, cars, pickup trucks, but also the buses, trucks, delivery vans that run on our roads. And this study also showed that transportation is expected to be the greatest source of load growth from an electricity perspective. We looked at this in details for the United States, and we saw that transportation could grow from 0.2% of electricity usage today to almost 25% by mid-century. So really a massive increase in electricity usage. And so, of course, the integration with the grid becomes a key aspect in this transition. A couple of points I wanted to make. First, in many countries, electricity demand hasn't really been growing significantly in the past, or at least in the past couple of decades. And so transportation electrification is an opportunity to grow that market, and is really welcomed by utilities. When I think about the United States, when I think about Europe, most of the developed countries, this is a transition that is very much welcomed by the electric utility. And so it's not necessarily an issue, it's something that is welcomed by the industry. In developing countries, where the grid is expanding already because of electricity demand growing for all other sectors, this of course adds a little bit more stress, right? Because now you have a growing system that needs to grow even faster. But one aspect that I think is really important to remember when we talk about electric vehicles that is not just increasing the demand for electricity, it's also offering unique opportunities to introduce flexibility. So electric vehicles can be charged at different point in time. What we see is that personal vehicles, for example, are driven only 5% of the time, and they are parked for 95 or more percent on average. And so that flexibility really can help operate and plan the power system, especially when it comes to integrating renewables. So my sense is that careful planning is needed, but overall, electric vehicles are really an opportunity to improve the efficiency of the power system. What can we do to support this planning? Well, as a national lab here in the US, what we have done is develop tools and develop data sets to try and inform this transition. Often, it's a problem to even understand what these charging loads might look like and how vehicles might need to be charged. And so what we try to do is to follow a data-driven approach and develop tools, develop data, develop insights. And all of this information is publicly available on our website. And so we're hoping that by providing this information, we can help smooth out the transition and hopefully also inform countries that are following the US in deploying electric vehicles. When it comes to charging, we have done very similar, we have kicked off very similar initiatives. We have a tool called EVI Pro that is freely available online, that can be used to estimate charging needs. But one thing I really want to stress here is that charging needs for electric vehicles are varied. Electric vehicles are different than gasoline vehicles. We don't need to replace gasoline stations with charging stations. Now, there are a lot more opportunities to charge electric vehicles. So it's important to remember, home charging, workplace charging, charging in grocery stores or theaters parking lot, as well as the fast charging stations that are similar to gasoline stations. But it's a much more complex network of charging with a lot of different needs and a lot of different nuances that is important to study and consider when thinking about charging stations for electric vehicles.
Well, that's very interesting and actually very useful work carried out by NREL on EV integration. Thanks for sharing. Now, Martina, coming back to you because I'd like to further explore the topic of charging infrastructure, a subject at which you have been working at the Swedish Energy Agency. So my question is, what business models have been tried and which ones have been more successful for public charging stations and for multifamily buildings? And if I may, one curiosity, how much do you see range anxiety shaping this business?
Yeah, thank you. The business models or the conditions to elaborate on the business models really differs between different electricity market designs. It varies between different countries, sort of what actors are actually eligible to be charge point operators. And from that, the business models varies with different types of charging infrastructure. Like Matteo mentioned, there are different types of charging infrastructure at home, at the workplace, and public. So it also varies with that. And the business model also depends on the parking situation, because as we had mentioned, the car has to be stationary while it's charged. Therefore, the parking space is really the marketplace for charging services. We mentioned some, but as I see it, there are three main types of charging business cases. It's the overnight home charging, which could be pretty similar to workplace. But this is foremost as at a private or at least non-public off-street parking facility. It could be a parking space outside a single-family house, but it could also be a parking lot outside a multi-family dwelling or a workplace. Here, it's really crucial to facilitate this charging stations really cheap to allow this low fuel price, which really motivates a higher purchase price of the electric vehicle. So the installations and the charging often takes place within a power contract of a building behind the meter. So there's plenty of opportunity to seek really cost-efficient installations. We see with load balancing, both between the different charging stations, but also together with the building's other electricity loads. And this is all to keep the overall electricity contract cost really low. So the property owner here can operate these charging stations and elaborate on different price, perhaps based on kilowatts which are charged, but also at fixed additional monthly cost on top of that they pay for the parking space. So that's the private overnight charging. And when we look at public charging, we really see two business cases, one for the on-street charging along sort of the streets and the pavements, and we see the off-street charging stations. And the off-street charging stations are often deployed at existing parking facilities, and could be deployed at the same principle as private off-street charging. It's really easy to get these installations cost-effective, offer this as a quite low cost. However, at least the European charge point operators are still exploring at what destinations this type of public charging is attractive, and where there is a market demand and also a willingness to pay for this charging. In Sweden, some business models for this is to have a fixed additional fee on the parking space when you have a charging station, because the core asset here is really the parking space. That's the expensive asset, and the charging is really seen more of as a service upgrade. But when you look at on-street parking, it's really visible. You see it, you can sort of see it and understand that it's good for charging, but it's a rather expensive installation compared to the off-street charging. And on-street charging is quite often perceived as sort of home charging for families living in households in cities. However, it could be difficult to have this on-street charging offered at a low enough cost for these families to sort of get their own business case of buying an EV. And then there's also the fast charging, either along streets or along highways. At least in the Nordic, this is really a complement to the much cheaper overnight home charging. So we see quite high willingness to pay this, because you don't use it every day. And if you understand that you don't use this every day, but more of as a complement, we see that there's a willingness to pay for that. And here we see different business model based on both that you pay per kilowatt hour, but also per minute, which depends on what the charge point operator decides on.
Well, that's very interesting to see the range of possibilities. And I believe they will continue these business models and solutions will continue to evolve as more EVs are integrated to the fleet and more drivers will demand charging infrastructure and services in the cities. Ilan, I have another question for you. EVs are one of the components of electric mobility, and the ultimate objective of these technologies is to build more sustainable cities. So we're talking about less traffic, less air pollution, more access to mobility services, social equity, access to better housing and public services. So in that sense, what recommendations would you give when municipalities consider adoption of EVs in their sustainable development plans and policies?
This is actually a very timely question. C40 has just supported 9 cities in the region to draft their climate action plans compatible with the Paris Agreement. So in fact, this was a question that we asked ourselves in the past 2 years. And of course, transportation being the main source of greenhouse gas emissions in the region was a crucial topic. And working with electric buses mainly, we developed the concept of roundtables. So we've had this in different countries with different cities. But basically, these were composed of a full day event with the city, so usually represented by the transportation department. Of course, urban planning is necessary, finance as well. The operators, because the operators are the ones in Latin America, at least, that are largely responsible for purchasing the buses according to the concessions from each city. The financial agencies, so the national development banks, private banks, BNDES, for example, in Brazil, or Findeter in Colombia, Bancolombia, which is a private bank. So you have to bring the finance sector as well. A third sector is also the bus providers. So we know that in Latin America, electric buses are still largely imported. We have a small production in the region that's mostly for setting up the buses. The production is still mainly abroad, but they are still here. We need to bring those providers to understand the prices, the products that are available, and also the energy utilities, because the energy utilities today, they can play different roles in the transition to especially electric bus fleets, because they have been working both as partners in the project, but also as financiers. This is what has happened in other countries and is still one of the preferred business models for cities that are now pursuing this transition. And of course, we also have to work with civil society. We have to work in communication strategies, in awareness strategies, to bring to the general public the benefits of electrification, so that people can understand what does that mean for their lives. That's, as you said, that's better air quality, that's better service. An electric bus usually is less noisy. It also has less movement, so it's a more pleasant trip on an electric bus rather than on a diesel bus. So we need this awareness raising campaign. But most importantly, we need to understand that this is not a transition that anyone will do by themselves. So within cities, we definitely need to work with the departments of transit, but also departments of urban planning, for example, so that new building codes, for example, have a mandate for charging stations, for instance. Or something that we're also developing with many cities is to have a zero emission area. That means that cities can define a specific part of the city, usually in downtown areas, that will be zero emission areas in a certain timeline. So let's say 2030, 2035. That means these areas will include only zero emission vehicles, both private and public, that there will be incentives for walking and cycling, that there will be strong nodes of both bus, subway, train systems. And this will then become part of a bigger strategy for sustainable cities. And finally, the business opportunities are only now starting. So for example, B2G, so bus to grid, this is a huge opportunity that operators have with working with utilities to find better deals, basically, so that buses can also provide energy to the grid. For instance, school buses, for 91% of the time they're stopped, they don't run. So for that time, if they have their batteries charged in peak hours, they can actually provide energy to the grid while they charge in off-peak hours, usually during the night. This is not so smooth for general public buses, as we know they run for longer periods of time, but it's still applicable, especially for off-peak hours, also for the public transit. A second opportunity is the second life of batteries. So there have been interesting studies going on in different countries in the region to understand what is the residual value of the batteries after usually 7 or 8 years, which is now the industry life of a battery, so that they can be used as stationary storage batteries. For how much can they be sold to the utility, to hospitals, to schools, to other buildings, so that they can be used for another 8 or 10 years? And how can we get this value in the original business model so that prices also go down? There are many opportunities and many complex and interesting factors that we're still taking into account, but they should all be on the table when we're planning for this kind of transition.
Yeah, in fact, electric vehicles should be part of a broader system, right? Based on a broader perspective and a range of policies and technologies to make cities more inclusive and more sustainable. So that's the goal, the ultimate goal, right? Matteo, I'd like to come back to the topic of EV integration to the grid. The integration of EVs seems to require additional clean power generation, may require grid expansion, may also require grid upgrades, as well as a smarter management and connectivity of both the power system and EVs. So my question is, how do EVs fit into a clean energy transition in the power sector without being a burden? And in that sense, how can EVs complement and support this transition?
Yeah, Thiago, that's a really good question. We are often asked whether EVs are a burden for the system, and people often talk about EVs. Will EVs break, quote unquote, the grid? That's a question that we're often asked. So in 2019, US Drive, which is a public-private partnership, including the Department of Energy here in the US, a lot of automotive, electric, and energy industry, teamed up and published a report where we basically looked at how much expected new load EVs could introduce. And we compared that to the rate at which the system has expanded in the past, starting from the mid-50s, so the 1950s here in the US. And what we found is that the system expanded in the past at rates that are greater than what would be required to support electric vehicles. So when we are asked whether EVs are going to break the grid or are a burden, I guess one really clean and nice answer is just looking at the past and say, like, hey, we expanded the grid faster than what it would be needed to accommodate vehicle electrification. So the same way that we did in the past, we don't really foresee any problem in doing it in the future. So that's our sort of looking backwards at whether EVs could be a problem. When we look forward, we see even more opportunities and even more excitement. I think there are two trends that are sort of colliding with one another. The first one is electrification of transportation, right? And other end users as well, but electrification is really a game changer because today transportation relies so much on petroleum. The other trend is the integration of renewables into the power system. And we see renewables cost dropping over time, and we see a lot of projections and forecasts really showing that renewables are going to play a critical and major role in future power systems. So these two trends are sort of converging, and there are key synergies between these two technologies. So one thing that variable renewable energy sources really struggle with, if you will, I'm not sure if struggle is the right word, but it's this concept of variability, right? You cannot decide when the sun shines or when the wind blows, right? And so the system now loses a little bit of flexibility. You can't dispatch a solar power plant the same way that you do with a fossil power plant, where you can just decide when you want to burn the fossil fuel. So the system loses some flexibility on the supply side, and that's where EVs can really complement this transition by offering flexibility on the demand side. So we have seen that the integration of electric vehicles and renewable energy sources can really complement each other and increase the synergies and the efficiency of the integrated system. We have done a couple of big studies that looked in general at electrification, but again, electric vehicles played a prominent role. One is called the Electrification Futures Study, EFS, and one was a study looking at how we can decarbonize the city of Los Angeles, called LA 100. And both studies are publicly available, or all the underlying data and results are publicly available. So I really encourage people to go and check out those detailed results on our website. But in both studies, we saw something interesting. Combining high level of electrification on electric vehicles with the transformation of the power system towards a decarbonized power system that has a lot of renewables really led to decreased electricity cost for all consumers, not just for EV drivers. Basically, what happens is that the flexibility in loads really makes it so much easier to plan and operate the power system. The system is just more efficient and it costs less for everyone. So the value of this flexibility is tremendous and can really benefit all consumers. So to tackle your question on how EVs can complement this transition, I think they are a great complement for the decarbonization of the power system and really a unique opportunity to decarbonize the two largest sectors in terms of greenhouse gas emissions today, transportation and the power system. So I really see the two going hand in hand and moving forward to help us reach a more sustainable future.
Thank you, Matteo, for your insights. Very good. Well, we are now heading to the end of our episode, and I'd like to have a last round to ask each of you to share one positive thing about the country or region you're based in that can make us optimistic about the clean energy transition. Ilan, can you start, please?
Sure, Thiago. I think I've said that at the risk of repeating myself, but we see a commitment from cities in Latin America to move towards electrification, mainly of buses. And again, this is the correct priority, having in mind the environmental, economic, social context of the region. So we have seen various mayors across the region committing themselves to zero emission transport and or low emission mobility that goes from Mexico City to Buenos Aires and everything in between. So the cities are taking this step forward. We also see some national governments moving forward. So Chile, Colombia, and Mexico already have clear electromobility strategies and policies that we see trickling down to actual projects on the ground. And these will only increase as prices and costs decrease. Again, also the innovation in business models is a huge trigger for other projects. And this is something that was basically tested and proven in the region. And this is something to celebrate because we were able to show in practice that 770 buses running in Santiago or the 1,400 buses that will be running in Bogota, they do not represent additional costs. In fact, in Santiago, buses that have been running for over 2 years and a half, the operator now is completely certain and convinced that he does no longer want to buy diesel buses for a simple reason. As much as he is committed to environmental or climate goals, it's a matter also of finance. The costs are lower, the costs are more predictable because he doesn't go through the cycles of the diesel price. He knows exactly how much he's going to pay for the next 10 years for the electricity. The cars are actually more efficient in terms of service. This has been already also documented. They are more efficient in their service than diesel buses. And people have also, the passengers have also approved and shown a considerably higher rate of acceptance and approval for electric buses than diesel buses. So I think this is a great story to tell from Latin America. There's still a long way ahead. The current moment really demands even bolder actions with the crisis in the transport system. We have to keep accelerating this change, but also using this very delicate moment that we're living in as an opportunity to also improve what can be improved right now. So one key thing is the separation of the contracts, for example, for buses, between the operation and the acquisition of the buses. This is key. This allows for better transparency, for better operation, and also for other means of financing the electric buses. This is something that not every country has done, but it's definitely a step forward. And we really hope at C40 to continue telling the success story for years to come.
Well, that's positive prospects from Latin America. Let's move now to Europe and hear what Martina has to tell us.
I would like to bring the notion that the Swedish truck manufacturers, Scania and Volvo, expect 50% of the trucks sold in 2030 in the EU to be battery electric. So that's every second truck. And that's only the expectations of today decided policy, which means that the number can only be tweaked upwards from there.
Well, thank you, Martina. Interesting numbers and also positive prospects from Europe. Now, Matteo, what would you like to share with us and highlight as a positive or something that makes you optimistic about the clean energy transition?
Sure, Thiago. And I guess one interesting aspect as I was listening to Ian and Martina here is that I think a lot of what they said is the same thing that I'm seeing here in the United States. And so perhaps this is really a global transition and global transformation. I totally agree with Ian, the consumer engagement and showing the value of vehicles on the road and how they can benefit in terms of maintenance and in terms of fuel costs and in terms of performance is critical. And it really makes me think that the adoption is going to ramp up. And as Martina said, the engagement on the manufacturers is surely a key aspect. And we're seeing the same things here in the US. Maybe as an engineer, I will add a third dimension to what they just mentioned, which is the technology progress. Batteries in particular evolved tremendously over the past 10 years. I think the cost of batteries just 10 years ago was over $1,000 a kilowatt hours. And today they are at about 150. So a tremendous drop in cost over just 10 years. And we are expecting batteries to drop below $100 per kilowatt hours in this decade. So in the 2020s. And we think that that's really the tipping point at which going to a dealer to purchase a car, consumers are going to start seeing a gasoline version, electric version costing the same. And so now you have the same purchase price, you save on fuel, you save on maintenance, you have better acceleration, you have no noise, the pathway to decarbonization, you don't have pollutants emission, you don't have your kids breathing all those pollutants that come out of tailpipes. And that really, I think, is indicating a convergence towards a transitions for electric vehicles. So I think technology is really important. But again, I agree with Ian and Martina, the consumers, the engagement, the OEM movement towards EVs are all working together. And I think they're working together at the global level. This is not a regional transition. It's something that's really happening all over the world.
Martina, Ilan, and Matteo, thank you so much for your time and a valuable contribution. It was a real pleasure. And I'd like to thank also the audience and invite you to listen to the other podcast episodes of Clean Energy Dialogues. Also, please check the 21st Century Power Partnership website at 21stcenturypower.org to find more about the work we do to move the world towards a clean energy future.